Alright, this is the second video of the introductory material. Again, what I would like all of you to be reading is Chapter 1 and specifically pages 2 through 30. So let's start out by just explaining what we're going to cover over the course of the next few minutes. We're going to talk about two really important aspects or concepts that are central to human geography. The first is region and the second is location. More importantly, what we're going to do is we're going to define and differentiate two different types of regions. The first is called a formal region, and the second is called a functional region. With regard to the second concept that we'll talk about, that is location, we are going to again define and differentiate two different types of location, two different aspects of location. The first is called site, and the second is called situation. So, why don't we get started? Let's start out by talking about region. I should just point out that in general, region is probably the most important in human geography. There are, of course, different types of regions. One of them is called a formal region. There's another name for a formal region. In addition to being called a formal region, you'll also sometimes hear it referred to as a uniform region. But don't get confused. Formal and uniform are basically synonyms for one another. They can be used interchangeably. To make sure that I'm not confusing all of you, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be consistent throughout the course. And through the next 3 weeks, I will continuously refer to formal regions as formal regions. So, let's move on to the definition. A formal region is a region that is based on internal homogeneity with regard to some variable. Now, if you don't know what the word homogeneity means, it basically means sameness. And here's where that word uniform comes into play. Internal uniformity. So a formal region is one where the region is basically based upon the idea that we've got some variable that is consistent and uniform throughout the entire region. One example would be the Corn Belt of the American Midwest. Let me show you by using this map right here. There is clearly a part of the United States where the dominant agricultural crop is the growing of corn, and it stretches through southern Minnesota and a pretty big part of Iowa, all the way into what looks like maybe the entire northern one half of Illinois. In that area right there, we have internal homogeneity with regard to one variable. That one variable is what type of agriculture tends to dominate. In this case, it's clearly corn. So this region right here, basically if you follow my cursor, that would be identifying what geographers would call the Corn Belt, and it's a good example of a formal region. I've got another example of a formal region. Let's return to that map of what Americans typically call soft drinks. Notice up here in the American Northeast, you've got internal uniformity, internal homogeneity with regard to this particular variable. In eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and throughout all of New England, people almost universally refer to soft drinks by the term soda. In the American Midwest, with just a few exceptions, they don't call it soda, they call it pop. And so you could quite literally refer to this region right here as a formal region. Again, defined by internal homogeneity, internal sameness, or another way of putting that, internal uniformity. The same thing could be true if we look a little more carefully at Wisconsin. Remember, we said that Wisconsin had kind of a split personality with regard to what people typically call soft drinks. The eastern part of the state, it looks as though just about all of the counties, the people who live there generically refer to soft drinks as soda. And then in the western part of the state, they generically refer to soft drinks as pop. So because you have these two regions that stand out as being fairly uniform internally, we would call eastern Wisconsin a formal region with regard to, in this case, what people typically call soft drinks. Western Wisconsin as well is a formal region because it's characterized by internal sameness, internal homogeneity, or internal uniformity with regard to, again, this one particular variable. Now, let's see if we can think of a few other examples. Think back to the first video that you watched. We had our first statistical map that showed the percent of the population that identified as Muslim. If you remember, Just about all of northern Africa, stretching from Morocco to Algeria to Egypt, was color-coded light blue. And what that means is that all of those countries in northern Africa, an overwhelming majority of the population identifies as Muslim. Therefore, the same thing could be said about northern Africa. Northern Africa is a formal region. In this case, with regard to the one variable, and the one variable we're interested in here is religion. Let's contrast our understanding of a formal region with a different type of region. That is a functional region. Just as was the case with regard to formal region, the concept of the functional region has another name that it goes by. Sometimes functional regions are also called nodal regions, but to be consistent, throughout the course of the next 3 weeks, I will consistently refer to this type of region as a functional region. Now, a functional region is entirely distinct from a formal region. Whereas a formal region is based on internal homogeneity, a functional region is instead based on economic connections. Another way of putting that is webs of dependency. So perhaps the best way of defining a functional region is to give some examples, and I have 2 listed here. The first is Chicago and the agricultural Midwest. The second is UW-Whitewater and its commuter shed. Let's start out with the first of these 2. Chicago is economically connected to the agricultural Midwest in multiple ways, just as the agricultural Midwest is connected to and dependent on Chicago. So webs of economic connections and dependency link the city of Chicago, which is basically the capital of the Midwest, with the agricultural land nearby in the surrounding and adjacent states. Well, how is that? Well, for one, it's in Chicago where you have the commodities exchange, where they basically determine and set the price of corn, the price of soybeans, and a variety of other agricultural products. And what this means is that the farmers of Nebraska and the farmers of Minnesota are connected to and dependent upon decisions that are made in Chicago. So one way of looking at it then is that Chicago is the capital or the node of a region called the American Midwest. And in this case, what defines the region is not necessarily internal homogeneity, but instead these kind of invisible webs of economic connections. Now, let's give the second example just a little bit more detail so you can see another way of defining and examining this idea of a functional region. UW-Whitewater is a place where a lot of people come to go to school, and a lot of people, of course, go to work. If we were to map out where people are driving from to get to UW-Whitewater, either to attend classes or to teach classes or to work, let's say, in the administration, we'd have what is called a commuter shed. Imagine this. There are people who come to UW-Whitewater either to work or to take classes who are coming from, let's say, Janesville. And others come in from Madison. Some even come in from Milwaukee and northern Illinois. Well, imagine if for each one of those individuals who comes to UW-Whitewater nearly every day, especially weekdays, we put a dot on the map. And then once we had all those dots on the map, we drew a line around that region, identifying basically what we would call UW-Whitewater's commuter shed. That then would as well be an excellent example of a functional region. It's not based on internal homogeneity, but instead on these kind of invisible economic connections. In this case, like Chicago was a node for the agricultural Midwest, UW-Whitewater is the node that basically brings together all these individuals into a coherent, functional region. Now, I've got one further example of this idea of a commuter shed, which hopefully will illustrate it just a little bit better. I've got this map here. And the map is basically of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in the center of the map, we have the node. The node is Tulsa's CBD, which stands for the Central Business District, basically downtown, the collection of skyscrapers where people work, typically in white-collar work. And then we have these residential suburbs nearby where presumably people live, but then they're commuting into downtown on weekdays, back and forth every weekday. So to give one example, Sand Springs is presumably a residential suburb, perhaps located 5 or 7 miles outside of downtown Tulsa. and about 1,000 commuters go back and forth every day to downtown. Over here, Broken Arrow, a little bit further away in an easterly direction, you've got about twice as many commuters going back and forth between Broken Arrow to downtown Tulsa. And then, of course, we could go through all of these other purple circles, but the point is that if we could draw a line around each one of these particular areas, we would have the commuter shed for downtown Tulsa. And thus, again, we would have a good example of a functional region. Again, it's these invisible economic connections to one single place and the borders that kind of capture that entire economic region that creates the basis for what we are going to call a functional region. All right, very good. Let's move on to the second of the two main topics that we're going to talk about today. The second has to do with location, and what we're going to do is we're going to differentiate between two different aspects of location. The first of these is called site. Site basically refers to those characteristics of a place that are internal to the place. And another way of talking about that is that site equals absolute location as opposed to relative location. Now I've got two examples here that hopefully will illustrate this just a little bit better. The first of these says UW-Whitewater is characterized by rolling topography, prairies, and forests. So notice what I'm saying here is that UW-Whitewater on the inside, internally, has these types of characteristics. Northern Minnesota is also a location, it's a place, and what I say here is that northern Minnesota is level and lake-studded with a boreal forest, which basically means pine forest. In both of these instances, what we're talking about are the internal characteristics of a place, and thus what we're talking about is the site. There is another aspect of location, and it's called situation. And what we're doing here when we're describing situation is we're talking about characteristics that are external to that particular place. And thus another word for this is relative location. Two examples of the situational aspect of places are following right here. UW-Whitewater is located 10 miles south of downtown Fort Atkinson. So notice what we're doing here. We're relating it to some other place. We're giving the relative location. Milwaukee is located on the western edge of the Great Lakes. Again, the same thing is true. We're talking about the relative location. Nothing about the internal characteristics of either UW-Whitewater or Milwaukee is mentioned. Now, almost always, interestingly, situation is more important to geographers because it typically has more consequences in terms of large-scale geographic outcomes. So I want to give you one final example to show how that is the case. And it has to do with northwestern Europe and its relative location to what is called the North Atlantic Drift, sometimes also called the Gulf Stream. To illustrate this a little better, I have this map right here. And what it shows is basically the North Atlantic Ocean. Western Europe is right through here. In particular, northwestern Europe is right along this area that is indicated by the cursor. North America, of course, is over here. Now what the Gulf Stream is a warm current, and it travels in a northeasterly direction. Its source area is down here in the Caribbean, and it travels off towards the northwest coast of Europe. The result of the North Atlantic Drift and its relative proximity to northwestern Europe is that northwestern Europe is remarkably warmer than it should be given its far northerly latitudinal location. That's especially in contrast to areas over here that are at the same latitude but are much colder. So for example, if you were to compare the January temperature of Stornoway, Scotland with Hopedale, Canada, I guarantee you that in Stornoway the temperature could likely be in January about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas over here in Hopedale, at the exact same latitude, the temperature is probably something like negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So the relative location of Europe and its proximity to the North Atlantic Drift means that northwestern Europe is much more habitable than it otherwise would be. Thus, situation is often very important in terms of determining geographic outcomes. All right, we'll see you all in the next video.